At 3:47 in the morning the blast hit. The trauma bay shook, lights swung, dust filled the air. Brooke Aldridge didn't flinch. She set her coffee down slowly and turned toward the sound. Outside chaos erupted. Inside she was perfectly calm. For 7 months, the SEALs at Forward Operating Base Atieno had called her the contract nurse. They thought she was just a civilian collecting hazard pay. They were about to find out how wrong they were. 6 months earlier, Brooke Aldridge stood in a one-bedroom apartment in Phoenix, Arizona, folding the same 3T shirts into the same olive drab duffel bag she'd been packing since she was 18 years old. The apartment didn't look lived in. It looked like a hotel room someone had occupied for a few months and never bothered to make their own. Bare walls, a single bookshelf with trauma medicine textbooks, and a dog-eared copy of War Fighting, the Marine Corps doctrinal manual she could still recite from memory. One photograph on the nightstand, 6 women in body armor, standing in a dusty Afghan village, grinning at the camera with their arms around each other. 5 of them were still alive. On the nightstand beside the photo sat a black memorial bracelet, stainless steel engraved with a name, a date, and a set of coordinates in Helmand Province. CPL Jessica Rook Peten USMC 14 the March 2016 and Ann Fear Zaven Kra and Nort Fear and Zest Daven and O. Brooke picked up the bracelet and slid it onto her right wrist. It clicked against the bone. It always clicked against the bone. She'd been wearing it for 9 years, and the sound still landed somewhere deep in her chest. The same place every time. "Okay, Rook," she said to the empty room. "One more." She was 38 years old. Sandy blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it could survive a helicopter ride. Gray-green eyes that people described differently depending on the light warm jade when she was laughing. Cold slate when she wasn't. A small scar bisected her left eyebrow. A souvenir from an IED in Helmand Province that had gifted her 3 stitches, and a headache that lasted 6 weeks. Her hands were calloused working hands, not surgeon's hands. She moved with an economy of motion that most people mistook for laziness until they saw how fast she actually was. Brooke had grown up in Prescott, Arizona, a small, quiet town an hour and a half north of Phoenix, where her father fixed Chevrolets for a living, and her mother served lunch to other people's kids at the elementary school. Nobody in her family had been to college. The military wasn't patriotism for Brooke, it was a way out. She'd enlisted in the United States Marine Corps at 18, boot camp at MCRD San Diego, trained as an 03 woman, a rifleman. The most basic and brutal job the Marine Corps had to offer. Then she'd been selected for the Lioness Program, a groundbreaking initiative that attached female Marines to infantry combat patrols in Iraq and Afghanistan to conduct security searches and engage with local women. One of the very first programs that put American women directly into ground combat. 3 combat deployments, 180 patrols, 23 firefights, a Bronze Star with Valor for carrying a wounded Marine 400 mu through an active ambush, a dead best friend. She'd gotten out as a staff sergeant after 10 years. Used her GI Bill to earn a nursing degree from Arizona State and spent 2 years working trauma at the Phoenix VA Medical Center. 2 years of fluorescent lights and paperwork, and patients who called her sweetheart in emergency rooms that moved too slowly for hands that still remembered how fast things could go wrong. Then Aegis Medical Solutions had called a private military medical contracting firm. They needed a trauma nurse for a joint special operations task force in East Africa. 12 months hazard pay. A forward operating base near the Djibouti-Somalia border, supporting counter-terrorism operations against Al-Shabaab. She'd said yes before they finished the sentence. The recruiter had paused on the other end of the line, probably surprised by the speed of her answer. Most nurses wanted time to think about it. Wanted to talk to their families, wanted to weigh the money against the risk. Brooke didn't have a family to consult. Her parents had both passed, her father from a heart attack at 61. Her mother from pancreatic cancer 2 years later. Both of them gone before Brooke ever figured out how to explain to them what she'd done in Afghanistan. She had no siblings, no partner, no kids. The apartment in Phoenix was a place she slept, not a place she lived. The truth was, she'd been ready to go back the moment she'd come home. Civilian life felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. Technically functional, but wrong in a way she felt with every step. Now she was 7 months into the deployment, running the night shift trauma bay at FOB Atieno, a small dust-choked outpost 40 km northwest of Beso that officially didn't exist. She lived in a containerized housing unit the size of a walk-in closet. She ate alone. She wore civilian scrubs, not a uniform. She didn't eat in the DFAC with the operators. She didn't talk about her past. The Navy SEALs on the FOB knew her as the contract nurse. Polite, competent, forgettable. Nobody had asked who she really was, and she hadn't volunteered. The duffel bag was packed. The apartment was empty. Brooke's bracelet was warm against her wrist. Brooke turned off the lights, locked the door, and drove to the airport in a truck that had 200,000 miles on it, and an OF veteran sticker she'd never bothered to peel off the bumper. She didn't look back. FOB Atieno sat on a patch of barren scrubland that God had forgotten and the US military had quietly claimed. HESCO barriers and concertina wire formed the perimeter. 2 hardened buildings, the Tactical Operations Center, and the medical facility anchored the compound. Everything else was tents, containerized housing units, and sandbag fighting positions baking in a 115-degree heat. At night the temperature dropped to 60, and the stars were so thick they looked fake, like someone had thrown a handful of glitter across a black ceiling. The Rolled 2 Forward Surgical Facility was Brooke's world. 3 connected ISO containers that held 2 trauma bays, 1 operating suite, and 8 recovery beds staffed by a Navy trauma surgeon, 2 nurses, 3 Navy corpsmen, and 1 anesthesiologist. Their job was damage control, stabilize and evacuate, not fix and finish. If you were hurt bad enough to land on their tables, you were getting a helicopter ride to Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti or Landtool in Germany. As soon as they stopped the bleeding, Brooke had settled into a rhythm. Night shifts. Coffee at midnight, rounds at 20 odred, paperwork at 40 odred, handoff at 60 odred. The young corpsmen rotated through her trauma bay like nervous puppies, eager, well-trained, and terrified of screwing up in front of the SEAL operators who treated the medical staff like furniture. One corpsman stood out. Petty Officer 3rd Class Dylan Mercer was 22 years old. 4 months into his first deployment, and so earnest it almost hurt to look at him. He had good hands and better instincts, but he'd never worked under fire. He reminded Brooke of someone, and it took her 3 weeks to figure out who herself at 19, lacing up boots for her first patrol in Helmand Province. That same mixture of raw talent and barely contained terror that you could see in the eyes if you knew what to look for. Brooke had started teaching him things. Small things at first. The right way to pack heostatic gauze so it deployed clean under pressure. How to read a patient's color before the monitors caught up. The difference between a tension pneumothorax and a simple pneumothorax by sound alone. One wheezed. The other didn't. And if you missed it, someone died. You're leaving the hemostatic gauze on the wrong shelf again, Brooke said during a quiet shift, her Arizona draw stretching the vowels the way it always did when she was tired. Dylan scrambled to fix it. Sorry, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am. I work for a living. The phrase came out before she could stop it. The oldest enlisted joke in the military. Dylan gave her a funny look. She changed the subject. The problem wasn't Dylan. The problem was Senior Chief Petty Officer Garrett Voss. Voss was the SEAL platoon leader on the FOB 6-1-2-10. Built like a weapon you'd want on your side in any fight anywhere on Earth. 14 years in the Navy, 11 as a SEAL. Dark brown hair buzzed tight. A jaw that looked like it had been carved from sandstone, and deep-set brown eyes that tracked everything and gave nothing back. He moved with the coiled, predatory ease of someone who'd kicked in a lot of doors and expected the next one to kick back. He was also, Brooke had decided within the first week, the most infuriating man she'd ever met, and she'd met a lot of infuriating men. Voss didn't trust contractors. More specifically, Voss didn't trust her. He'd made that clear the day she arrived, and he'd been making it clearer every day since. Let me be clear, Aldridge, Voss had said during their first medical brief, standing in the middle of the trauma bay like he owned it. My operators come back hurt. They get treated by my corpsmen. Not by some contract nurse who got her trauma from a weekend seminar. Brooke had looked at him for a long time. The kind of long time that made other people uncomfortable. Then she'd said in a voice so calm it barely registered as speech, Your Petty Officer Navarro missed a tension pneumothorax on your last post-op patient. I caught it. Your operator is alive because I was here. You can dislike me, Senior Chief, but you can't argue with the vitals monitor. Voss hadn't responded. He just walked out. After he left, Brooke stood alone in the trauma bay for a full minute, her hands flat on the stainless steel counter, feeling her pulse in her fingertips. She wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury she'd stopped affording herself somewhere around her second deployment, when she'd learned that the things that made you angry were usually the things you couldn't control. And wasting energy on things you couldn't control was a good way to die in Helmand Province. She was something else, something quieter and deeper than anger. She was tired of being unseen. Tired of the casual cruelty of assumptions that a woman in civilian scrubs couldn't possibly know what she was doing. That hazard pay meant tourist, that the only people who understood combat were the ones currently wearing the uniform. She thought about Rook, about the day they'd been assigned as FEC partners, 2 women in a world built for men. And Rook had looked at her and said, "They're going to underestimate us every day. Let's use it." Brooke flexed her hands, turned back to her station, and used it. But it got worse. He went over her head to the base commander, requesting qualified military medical staff to replace her. He insisted his corpsmen handle all pre-hosp care, cutting Brooke out of the loop. He questioned her clinical decisions in front of other personnel. He refused to brief her on upcoming operations. Need to know and you don't. Brooke understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. Voss wasn't evil. He was a devoted leader who'd seen contractors freeze under fire and get people killed. She'd heard the story from Chief Petty Officer Thomas Navarro, the SEAL platoon's senior medic, a steady, observant man who'd been quietly impressed by Brooke's skills since week 1. He lost a guy named Martinez. Navarro told her one night in the trauma bay, keeping his voice low. Last deployment, forward aid station. Contract medicis rolled in. Martinez bled out on the floor while this guy just stood there shaking. Senior Chief's been carrying that ever since. Brooke nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just kept showing up, doing her job, and absorbing the hostility like she'd been absorbing things her entire life, like an anvil. The weeks passed in a rhythm of heat, dust, and the low-grade tension that lived in every forward operating base on Earth. The constant awareness that something bad was always 30 seconds away. Brooke taught. Dylan learned. Voss seethed. One night, 3 weeks before the world changed, a SEAL operator came back from a patrol with a gunshot wound to the upper arm. Through and through, brachial artery intact, but the bleeding was heavy and the operator was pale from blood loss. Brooke stabilized him in 19 minutes IV access, packed the wound, started a transfusion, prepped him for medevac textbook. Voss watched from the doorway. When Brooke finished, he turned to his corpsman and said loud enough for the entire trauma bay to hear, "Double-check her work." The corpsman Navarro looked at Brooke. She shook her head once, barely perceptible. "Don't." Navarro double-checked the work anyway. Not because he doubted her, but because Voss was his senior chief, and that was how it went. He found nothing wrong. He told Voss everything was solid. Voss said nothing and left. The operator on the table, a 26-year-old from Nebraska with a wife and a baby daughter back in Virginia Beach, looked up at Brooke. "That dude's got a problem with you." "That dude," Brooke said, adjusting his IV drip, "is going to have a problem with anyone who isn't one of his guys. It's not personal. Feels personal." Brooke almost smiled. "It always does. Try not to move your arm. I just packed that wound, and I don't want to repack it, because you wanted to scratch your nose." The operator laughed, then winced, then laughed again. She was good at that, at putting people at ease while she worked on them, at making the terrible seem manageable through the sheer force of calm competence. It was a skill she developed not in nursing school, but on her knees in Afghan dust, holding together Marines who were terrified and bleeding and needed someone to tell them it was going to be okay, even when it probably wasn't. Brooke watched Voss go, then turned back to the patient. Her hands were steady, her face was blank, but something behind her eyes had gone very still and very quiet, the way a lake goes still before a storm rolls in. Later that night, she sat outside the trauma bay on an overturned ammo crate, staring at the East African sky. The stars were impossible out here. No light pollution for 100 miles in any direction. Just the Milky Way sprawled across the darkness like a river of crushed diamonds. The air smelled like dust and diesel and the sharp medicinal tang of the surgical suit behind her. She touched the bracelet on her right wrist. "I found another one, Rook," she said quietly, to nobody, to the stars. To a dead woman buried in Arlington National Cemetery who had been 24 years old and afraid of spiders and could field strip an M4 faster than anyone in their platoon. Young, scared, good hands. "I'm going to keep him alive, I promise." She remembered the day she'd held Rook in that ditch in Nawa district. Remembered the weight of her, The wet heat of the blood, the way Brooke's eyes had found hers and stayed there, focused and calm, as if Brooke's face was the last thing she wanted to see, and she was okay with that. The IED had taken Brooke's legs below the knees, and there was nothing to be done about it. Nothing that any amount of training or hemostatic gauze or desperate prayer could fix, and they both knew it. And Brooke had said, and Brooke would carry this until the day she died. Brooke had said, "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." She'd been scared. Brooke knew because she'd felt the trembling, but she'd told Brooke's mother exactly what Brooke asked her to say, and she'd kept saying it to herself every night since. She wasn't scared. She wasn't scared. She wasn't scared. The generator hummed. Somewhere on the FOB, someone was playing country music badly on a guitar. A dog, one of the strays that lived around the perimeter, barked once and went quiet. Brooke closed her eyes. She'd been having the dream again, the one where she was back in Helmand, walking a dirt road with Brooke beside her. And Brooke was telling her something important, but Brooke couldn't hear the words. And then the road wasn't there anymore. Just the sound, just the pressure, just the feeling of holding someone who was already gone and not being able to let go. Because if she let go, it meant it was real. She opened her eyes. Staff Sergeant Omar Baptist was standing 10 feet away, watching her. He was a Marine, one of the embassy security group Marines assigned to FB's security detail. The only other Marine on the entire base. 34 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that Marines who'd seen things got quiet. He'd been watching Brooke for weeks with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself. The look of someone who sees something familiar in a stranger and can't quite place it. "Can't sleep?" Brooke asked. "Perimeter check," Baptist said. He paused. "You do that thing again." "What thing?" "The scanning thing. Every time you walk across the FOB, you check your corners. You count exits. You keep your back to walls." He tilted his head. "Contract nurses don't do that." Brooke held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Good night, Staff Sergeant," and went back inside. Baptist stood there a moment longer. Then he walked to the armory, signed out a M9 sidearm, and placed it in the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet in the trauma bay. They never discussed it. The intelligence reports were getting worse. Increased surveillance activity around the FOB, unusual foot traffic in the Wadis, the dry riverbeds that snaked through the scrubland, and provided concealment for anyone who wanted to approach unseen. The daily threat brief posted outside the Tactical Operations Center used words like elevated and credible and imminent. The kind of words that made experienced people pay very close attention. Brooke read the threat brief every morning. Nobody noticed because contract nurses weren't supposed to care about that. She started sleeping in the trauma bay. Dylan noticed. "You okay, Brooke? You've been sleeping here all week." "Closer to the coffee," she said. He laughed. She didn't. 3 nights before the attack, Brooke was walking back from the latrine when a generator backfired a sharp percussive bang that split the silence. She dropped low, her hand reaching for a sidearm she wasn't carrying. Her body already rotating toward the sound with the instinctive precision of someone who'd heard that sound 1,000 times. And it had meant something very different. She caught herself in half a second, stood up, brushed the dust off her scrubs. Behind her, Navarro was standing in the shadows, a bottle of water in his hand. He'd seen the whole thing. Their eyes met. Navarro didn't say a word. But the next morning, he went to Voss and said something he'd never said before. "Senior, you need to ease up on Aldridge. I don't know where she learned what she knows, but she's better than half the corpsmen I've trained. She's not the problem." Voss looked at him. "She's a civilian." "Yeah," Navarro said. "Maybe." The night before the attack, Brooke did something she almost never did. She sat with Dylan in the trauma bay during a quiet shift and told him a story. Not the whole story, not yet, just a piece of it. "I had a friend once," she said, turning a suture packet over in her hands. "She was younger than you. Best hands I ever saw in anyone. Steady, like she was born knowing where the bleeding was going to come from." Dylan was sorting IV bags on the shelf, but he'd stopped. He could hear something in her voice, a texture he hadn't heard before, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. What happened to her? Brooke was quiet for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them. Outside, the wind pushed sand against the container walls with a sound like whispered static. "She taught me that the most important thing you can do in this job isn't the procedure. It's the presence. You being there, your hands on the patient, your voice in their ear telling them they're not alone. She paused. She taught me that, and then she was gone and I was the one kneeling in the dirt, wishing someone was telling me I wasn't alone. Dylan sat down the IV bag. Brooke. The point, she said, and her voice was steady again. The way a river is steady over sharp rocks is that you have good hands, Dylan. And I'm going to make sure you know how to use them. Because someone did that for me once, and it's the most important thing anyone ever gave me. He looked at her. Really, looked at her. The way you look at someone when you realize they're not quite who you thought they were. How do you stay so calm? He asked. Doesn't it ever get to you? Every single time, Brooke said. I just got good at being scared quietly. You will too. Were you always a nurse? The pause lasted 3 heartbeats. Then she deflected the way she always did. I was a lot of things. Right now I'm your instructor and you're still leaving the heistic gauze on the wrong shelf. 3rd shelf. Left side. We've been over this. Dylan smiled and went back to sorting. Brooke stared at the wall. The wall of the ISO container was corrugated steel, dented in places, patched in others. Someone had taped a photo of a golden retriever to it, one of the corpsman's dogs back home, a big doofy animal named Biscuit, who was apparently excellent at destroying furniture. Brooke looked at that photo of that stupid happy dog and felt something tight in her chest release half a turn. The way a valve releases pressure. She didn't know who she'd be without this, without the teaching, the passing on, the quiet act of making someone else better. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. Not the fighting, not the medals, not the deployment pay. This 2 hands teaching 2 other hands in a metal box in the middle of nowhere. And calling it enough, Commander Elise Taggart found her an hour later standing outside the trauma bay in the darkness. Taggart was the Navy trauma surgeon running the role. 244 years old. Calm, experienced, and one of the only people on the FOB who knew the truth about Brooke Aldridge. Taggart had read her full contractor file the day she arrived. She knew about the Lioness Program. She knew about the Bronze Star. She knew about the 180 combat patrols and the dead F-8 partner and the 3 Helmand deployments. She also knew that Brooke hadn't told anyone, and she respected that. You've been reading the threat brief. Taggart said it wasn't a question. Surveillance activity is increasing. Brooke said the WAD is to the south. There's been foot traffic at night and the pattern is closing in. Each contact report is 200 or 300 m closer to the wire than the last one. Taggart studied her. The threat assessment says low to moderate. The threat assessment is wrong. Brooke's voice was flat. Certain. The voice of someone who had walked roads in Afghanistan that looked safe until they weren't. They're probing the perimeter, testing response times, mapping our patterns. Whoever wrote that assessment hasn't been on the ground at a FOB that was about to get hit. And you have. Brooke said nothing. Her eyes were on the horizon. The dark line where the scrubland met the sky. Visible only because the stars stopped. Taggart nodded slowly. What do you need? I need the trauma base staged for mass casualty. Extra blood products, extra hemostatic agents, airways, and chest seals staged at every bed. And I need Dylan to run a combat trauma drill tomorrow night, because that kid has never worked under fire. And if something happens, he needs the muscle memory, or he'll freeze. I'll authorize it. One more thing. Brooke hesitated. Baptiste left a sidearm in my supply cabinet. Taggart looked at her for a long moment. I didn't hear that. Yes, ma'am. And Brooke. Taggart's voice softened. If it comes to it, I'll be in the O. The trauma bay is yours. Brooke nodded. She understood what Taggart was really saying. I know who you are. I trust you. Do what you need to do. She went back inside and started staging the trauma bay for a fight she hoped would never come. The vehicle-borne improvised explosive device detonated against the south wall of FOB Atieno at 03:47 hours on a Tuesday morning. The sound was unlike anything Dylan Mercer had ever heard. Not a bang, but a physical force. A wall of pressure that hit his chest and threw him sideways into the recovery beds. The lights died. The emergency generator kicked in 2 seconds later. Bathing the trauma bay in red, Brooke was already moving. It was the strangest thing Dylan had ever seen. One moment she was standing at the counter, reviewing a patient chart, the next moment, and there was no transition, no hesitation, nothing in between. She was someone else. Her posture changed. Her voice dropped. Her eyes, which he'd always known as warm jade in the fluorescent light, went flat and cold, and focused in a way that made his stomach clench. Dylan, Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Triage protocol. Now move the post-op patient behind the supply crate. He's ambulatory. Walk him there. Go. He went. He didn't think about it. He just went because her voice left no room for anything else. Outside the world was ending. Automatic weapons fire AK-47s. He would later learn. The distinctive clatter of Kalashnikov actions ripped through the darkness from the south side of the FOB. The base alarm was screaming. People were shouting. Someone was firing back with an M240. The deep, steady, boom boom, boom of a belt-fed machine gun that he could feel in his teeth. Brooke was transforming the trauma bay into a fortress. She shoved equipment behind the reinforced supply crates. She positioned the drug cart as cover for the operating suite entrance, where Taggart was already scrubbing in. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet, took out Baptist's sidearm, checked the magazine, racked the slide, and set it on the counter within arm's reach. She did all of this in less than 45 seconds. Then the wounded started coming. The first was a SEAL operator with shrapnel wounds, fragments of the HESCO barrier that the VBI had turned into high-velocity projectiles. He was bleeding from his face, his arms, his chest. He stumbled through the trauma bay door, half carried by another operator who was shouting something about the south wall being gone. The whole south wall. They're coming through. Set him here, Brooke said, pointing to the first trauma bed. Dellin, primary survey. March protocol. Start with the massive hemorrhage. I see arterial on the left arm, tourniquet above the wound. You know this. Go. Dellin's hands were shaking. He looked at the blood on the floor, on the operator's face, on his own scrubs. And for one terrible second, his mind went completely white. A blank wall where his training used to be. Dillon. Brooke's voice again. Not loud, low. The kind of low that went under the panic and found the part of him that still worked. Look at me, not at the blood. At me? He looked at her. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were already working on the second operator, who had a penetrating wound to the abdomen. You know this, she said. We practiced this. Clamp, pack, hold. Do it now. His hands stopped shaking. He clamped, he packed, he held. The gunfire was getting closer. Two more operators came through the door. One was walking. The other was being dragged by Chief Petty Officer Navarro, and Navarro was limping badly, his left thigh dark and wet, a through gunshot wound. He'd been hit outside the toe C and had still managed to carry his wounded teammate 40 ambured to the medical facility. Brooke looked at Navarro's leg. She looked at the growing pool of blood beneath it. She made a calculation that took less than a second. Dylan. Take Navarro tourniquet high and tight on the left thigh. He's going to tell you it's fine. It's not fine. Ignore everything he says and stop the bleeding. I'm fine. Navarro grunted from the floor. See? Brooke said, already turning to the next patient. Then Staff Sergeant Baptist appeared in the trauma bay doorway. He was in full kit body armor, helmet, rifle. His face was stir with dust and sweat. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been in combat before and recognized the geometry of what was happening. Aldridge, they're coming through the south side. 8 to 12 dismounts. They're heading for the medical facility. The words hung in the air. The medical facility was the softest target on the OB. A building full of wounded people and medical staff, not hardened operators. If the attackers reached it, everyone inside was dead. Baptist unslung the M4 from his back and held it out to her. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was recognition. One Marine to another. The kind of recognition that doesn't require words. Brooke caught the rifle one-handed. She conducted a functions check, tap, rack, assess in under 2 seconds. The muscle memory of 180 combat patrols. Her hands moved with a fluency that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with a decade spent learning how to fight and bleed and survive in the worst places on earth. Dillon was staring at her. His tourniquet was in place. Navarro's bleeding was controlled, but his eyes were on Brooke and the rifle. And his face was the face of someone watching a stranger step out of a person they thought they knew. Stay with the patients, Brooke told him. No matter what you hear, stay. She turned toward the door, toward the gunfire, toward the darkness, and she stopped being a nurse. What happened over the next 20 minutes would be reconstructed from multiple accounts, during the after-action review, from Baptist's report, from the SEAL operator's statements, from the Tactical Operations C Center's radio logs, and from Dylan Mercer, who could see pieces of it through the trauma bay window, and would never forget any of it. Brooke Aldridge fought like a Marine. Not like a nurse who happened to pick up a gun. Like an infantry marine who'd picked up scrubs for a while and just picked the gun back up. She moved with Baptist from the trauma bay entrance to a sandbagged position 15 meters south. Using fire and maneuver, the foundational tactic of Marine infantry combat, she established a sector of fire. She engaged targets with controlled pairs. 2 rounds recess. 2 rounds. Recess the disciplined, economical shooting of someone trained to make every bullet count. Contact, 20 75 m, 2 dismounts behind the Hesco, she called out, her voice carrying across the firefight. With the practiced clarity of someone who'd done this in places that made East Africa look like a vacation, Baptist didn't hesitate. He shifted fire. The attackers, an al-Shabaab splinter cell that had been surveilling the FOB for weeks, had breached the south wall with the VBD and sent a dismounted assault force straight toward the medical facility. They knew wounded American operators were inside. They wanted to kill Americans and film it for propaganda. What they hadn't expected was a 45-minute combined arms defense that met them with rifle fire, machine gun suppression, and eventually attack helicopters. And they hadn't expected Brooke. She fell back to the trauma bay twice during the engagement. Not retreating, transitioning. The first time she conducted a combat cricorotomy on a SEAL operator whose airway was compromised by shrapnel to the throat. She performed the procedure by headlamp while rounds impacted the container wall 2 fact above her head, her hands moving with a steadiness that bordered on supernatural. She'd last done this procedure in Helmand Province, in the dark on her knees, and her hands remembered. The second time she treated Navarro's gunshot wound, properly heostatic gauze pressure bandaged the whole sequence, while simultaneously coaching Dylan through an arterial bleed on the shrapnel patient. Keep pressure here, she told Dylan, positioning his hands. Don't let go for anything. You hear that shooting? It doesn't exist. This wound exists. You in this wound. That's your whole universe right now. Then she picked the rifle back up and went back to the door. It was during the Defense of the South approach that Brooke got on the tactical radio. The SEAL Tactical Operations Center was coordinating the defense across multiple elements. SEAL operators base security, the QRF that had been scrambled from Camp Lemonnier. The radio net was chaos. Then a new voice cut through. Unknown station on this net. Identify yourself. It was Baptist, maintaining radio discipline, even in the middle of a firefight. He knew who was talking, but the net needed to know. Brooke keyed the handset. And in that moment something shifted. The careful civilian mask she'd worn for 7 months. The quiet, competent contract nurse who didn't eat with the operators and didn't talk about her past cracked and fell away. What came through the radio was the voice of a woman who had walked 180 patrols through the most dangerous terrain on Earth and lived to walk 181. This is Ainville. Staff Sergeant Brooke Aldridge, USMC, formerly attached to 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines War Dogs. I have 3 urgent surgical and 1 expectant at the roll 2. I need fire suppression on the south approach and medevac wheels up in 15 mechs. How copy? 3 seconds of silence. The kind of silence that falls when a room full of professionals hears something they didn't expect and has to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Then Baptist's voice, steady and warm, and carrying the weight of a brotherhood that transcended branches and badges and everything else that kept people apart. Copy all Anvil. Fire suppression en route. Medevac is spinning up and Sirfi Staff Sergeant in the Tactical Operations Center. A SEAL communications operator looked at his chief. Who the hell is Anvil? Nobody answered because nobody knew yet. The QRF arrived 12 minutes later. MH-60M Blackhawks with door gunners lighting up the south approach, followed by a ground element that swept the perimeter and eliminated the remaining attackers. The firefight ended the way all firefights end, abruptly, with a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise it replaced. In the trauma bay, Brooke set down the M4, picked up a suture kit, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, and went back to being a nurse as if the last 45 minutes had been a dream someone else had. Dylan Mercer stood in the corner, a tourniquet still in his hand, blood on his scrubs, and stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time, because he was. The after-action review took place 14 hours later in the Tactical Operations Center. Every operator, support staff member, and medical person on the FOB was present. Senior Chief Voss sat in the back row. He'd been one of the first SEAL operators to respond to the breach and had spent the firefight on the west side of the compound. unaware of what was happening at the medical facility until the radio call. He hadn't said a word since. Commander Taggart stood at the front of the room. She was still in surgical scrubs. She'd spent the entire engagement in the operating suite, trusting Brooke to handle everything outside the O. She'd been right to trust. Before we begin the tactical debrief, Taggart said, I need to address something. She opened a file, Brooke's full contractor personnel file. The one that Aegis Medical Solutions had provided and that Taggart had read on day one and kept to herself ever since. Our contract trauma nurse, Brooke Aldridge, coordinated the defense of the medical facility, treated 4 combat casualties under fire, performed a field cricorotomy during the engagement, and coached our junior corpsman through his first combat trauma. She did this while simultaneously engaging enemy combatants with rifle fire alongside Staff Sergeant Baptist. Taggart looked at the room. Every face was turned toward her. Miss Aldridge is a former United States Marine Staff Sergeant 0311 Infantry. She was a pioneer of the Lioness Program, one of the first women attached to infantry combat patrols in Afghanistan. She conducted over 180 combat patrols with 2nd Battalion 7th Marines in Helmand Province. She participated in 23 direct engagements. She earned a Bronze Star with Valor for carrying a wounded Marine 400 ambush through an active ambush. The room was silent, not the polite silence of people listening, the weighted silence of people recalculating. She subsequently served with the Female Engagement Team program, conducting village stability operations and intelligence gathering during a 3rd deployment to Helmand Province. Her intelligence work provided target packages for multiple joint special operations missions in the region. Taggart paused. Let the next words land, including Operation Hammerfall. In the back of the room, Senior Chief Voss went pale. His hands resting on his knees went still. His jaw tightened in a way that only people who knew him well would have noticed. And in this room, everyone knew him well. Operation Hammerfall, September 2014. A nighttime raid on a Taliban weapons cache in a compound outside Nawabrik-Zai. Voss had led the assault element. The compound was exactly where the intelligence said it would be. The defenses were exactly as predicted. The layout, the guard rotations, the escape routes, all of it mapped with a precision that Voss had attributed to signals intelligence and drone surveillance. He'd never asked where the original human intelligence had come from. He'd never thought to ask. Operators didn't ask about the quiet work that made their loud work possible. It was the nature of the machine. 3 of his operators had nearly died that night. The Taliban fighters had been more heavily armed than expected, and the firefight had lasted 45 minutes. Voss had dragged one of his wounded men to cover, returned fire, called in the QRF, and held the position until air support arrived. He'd earned his Silver Star for that night. He'd earned his promotion. He'd earned everything that had made him Senior Chief Petty Officer Garrett Voss, SEAL Platoon Leader, the man who kicked down doors and brought his boys home. Every bit of it built on intelligence that Brooke Aldridge had gathered while walking through Afghan villages in body armor, sitting cross-legged on dirt floors, drinking tea with terrified women, earning their trust 1 cup, 1 smile, 1 promise at a time. 6 months of patient, invisible, dangerous work. The kind of work that nobody filmed and nobody celebrated and nobody remembered unless you were the woman who'd done it. He'd built his legend on her groundwork, and he had spent 7 months calling her the contract nurse. The debrief continued. Brooke sat in the 2nd row, her face as blank as it always was. Brooke's bracelet catching the light on her right wrist. She didn't add to Taggart's account. She didn't correct or embellish. When it was over, she stood up and walked back to the trauma bay to check on her patients. Dylan caught her outside. Staff Sergeant. Brooke, why didn't you just tell us? Brooke stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. Really looked at him the way she had during the firefight, when his hands were shaking, and she'd told him to look at her instead of the blood. Because you needed to learn to trust the nurse, she said. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the Bronze Star. You needed to trust the person who showed up every shift and taught you where to put the high-stick gauze. She paused. That's who I am, Dylan. The rest is just where I learned it. Dylan's eyes were bright. He nodded. He couldn't speak. Brooke put a hand on his shoulder. You did good tonight. Rook would have liked you. Who's Rook? Brooke touched the bracelet on her wrist. Someone who had good hands, like you. Then she went back to work. The apology came at 0:30. The next night, Brooke was in the trauma bay, her usual spot, her usual hour. The patients were stable. The base was quiet. The south wall had been repaired with fresh HESCO barriers, and the FOB had that peculiar heightened calm that settles over a place that's just survived something terrible. Voss appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the counter in front of Brooke, sat down across from her, and didn't speak for a long time. "I lost a guy," he said finally. "Martin. He bled out at a forward aid station because the contract medic there didn't know what he was doing. He froze. Martinez died while this guy stood there shaking. I've been carrying that for 2 years. I put it on you and that wasn't fair." Brooke looked at the coffee. "She didn't touch it. I know about Martinez," she said. "Navarro told me." Voss nodded slowly. "I checked the dates on your FET deployment. Helmand 2014. You were the one who developed the target package for Operation Hammerfall. I talked to women in villages for 6 months to build that package. 3 of my guys are alive because of that raid. I got my silver star because of that raid." Brooke was quiet. "Then I know." Voss looked up. "You knew this whole time I'm a nurse senior chief. I pay attention to my patients' records." The silence stretched. Outside the generator hummed. The stars burned over East Africa. "I want to make this right," Voss said. Brooke finally picked up the coffee, took a sip. It was terrible. The same burnt bitter mud that every FOB on Earth had been brewing since the beginning of war. "Then trust the next person who doesn't look the part," she said. "I almost wasn't here because people like you kept telling me I didn't belong." Voss nodded. He stood up. He left the coffee. He went. In the weeks that followed, things changed at FOB Atieno. Not dramatically, not with announcements or ceremonies, but in the quiet, practical ways that mattered. The SEAL operators stopped calling Brooke the contract nurse. They called her Brooke. Some of them, after a few beers, called her Anvil. She told them to stop. They didn't. Voss stopped calling her anything at all. He just nodded when she walked by, the small, tight nod of someone acknowledging a peer, a warrior recognizing another warrior. It wasn't friendship. It was something older and simpler than that. Respect. A small Marine Corps flag appeared in the trauma bay one morning, hung on the wall behind Brooke's station. Nobody claimed responsibility. Baptist didn't meet her eyes. She didn't take it down. Navarro recovering from surgery from his hospital bed. Anvil. That's a good call sign. Suits you. Shut up and let me change your bandage. Brooke said, but she was almost smiling. The SEAL who'd asked about Navarro's pneumothorax, the one from Nebraska with the wife and the baby daughter, found Brooke in the DIFAC one evening. He was eating with his teammates, and she was eating alone at her usual corner table. Because 7 months of habit was hard to break, even after the world changed, he walked over, set his tray down across from her, and sat. No announcement, no speech. He just sat down, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and started talking about his daughter's first birthday, which he'd missed, and the video his wife had sent of the baby face planting into a cake. Brooke laughed. Actually laughed. The sound surprised both of them. Then 2 more operators brought their trays over. Then Dylan, then Baptist. By the end of the week, Brooke's corner table wasn't a corner table anymore. It was just a table. Dylan started calling her Staff Sergeant. She had to tell him to stop because it made her feel old. And late at night, when the FOB was quiet, and the stars were out, and the coffee was cold, Brooke would sit in the trauma bay and touch the bracelet on her right wrist and say, "We're okay, Brooke. We're okay." 5 months later, Brooke Aldridge stood in the same apartment in Phoenix, setting her duffel bag on the same bed. The walls were still bare. The books were still on the shelf. The room was still spare. But now there was a new photograph on the nightstand. 6 people standing in front of a dusty medical container in East Africa. Brooke in the center, flanked by Dylan and Navarro and Baptist and Tagart, and standing slightly apart with his arms crossed and the ghost of a smile on his face. Garrett Voss. They were sunburned and tired and alive, and Brooke was smiling the rare transformative smile that changed her entire face. It was the first photo where she was smiling. She set it next to Rook's picture. 2 photos, 2 families. On her right wrist, Rook's memorial bracelet. On her left, a new one woven from 550 paracord in the Marine Corps colors of scarlet and gold. Handmade by Staff Sergeant Omar Baptist the night before she'd rotated home. 2 bracelets, 2 families, 1 Marine. Brooke Aldridge, the contract nurse, the Lioness, the woman who'd walked 180 patrols through hell and come out the other side with steady hands and a quiet voice, and a heart that still had room to teach one more kid where to put the highest gauze, stood in her apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the invisible woman. She felt like she belonged. Here's what Brooke Aldridge's story teaches us. And it's not the lesson you might expect. It's not about proving yourself. It's not about the grand reveal or the moment the doubters are silenced or the satisfaction of watching someone eat their words. It's about this. The fire doesn't care what branch you served. It doesn't read your service record or check your contractor badge or count the medals on your chest. The fire just asks one question. What kind of person are you? And the answer isn't something you can put on a resume or hang on a wall. It's something that lives in your hands when they're steady and the world is shaking. It's something that lives in your voice when it drops low enough to reach a scared kid who's forgotten his training. It's something that lives in the space between two people who started as strangers and ended as family because they bled together on a Tuesday morning in East Africa when the South Wall came down. Brooke Aldridge didn't need a uniform to be a Marine. She didn't need a rank to lead. She didn't need a weapon to fight. Although when the time came, she was very good with one. She just needed someone to see her. And when they finally did, what they saw was someone who had been there all along. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones nobody notices until the moment everyone needs them. Before you go, let me say something real. We don't tell these stories for the algorithm. We tell them for people who understand what it means to serve quietly. If Brooke's story hit you, especially that moment when she keyed the radio and said, "This is Anvil, take 1 second," and hit the like button. That tells this platform stories like this matter. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever seen someone underestimated turn out to be the one who saved the day? I read every single one. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And if someone in your life needs this reminder, share it with them. Be someone's Anvil today. The world has enough hammers.